Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, I am genuinely so excited to guide you through this today because we're taking a look at a civilization that feels incredibly familiar to all of us, yet is often completely misunderstood. We're going to cover about 4,000 years of ancient Egyptian history, and I promise you, by the time we wrap this up, we're going to shatter almost everything you think you know about this absolutely iconic civilization. Let's just dive right in with a massive reality check. When you picture ancient Egypt, you probably visualize a tourist riding a camel past the Great Pyramid, right? Well, fact check, camels were absolutely not in Egypt when the pyramids were built 4,500 years ago. No way. And honestly, it's a brilliant metaphor for our broader understanding of Egypt. It's instantly recognizable, but all too often completely misleading. So we're going to strip away those myths today and look at the surprising, cyclical reality of a nation that repeatedly died and came back to life. Section 1, Birth by the River, From Savannah Nomads to the Two Lands. Okay, so forget those images of monumental stone builders living out in a harsh desert. The earliest Egyptians were actually nomadic hunters living in a lush green African savanna, but nature forced them to adapt incredibly fast. Back in 19,000 BC, these nomads were busy carving rock art of wild cattle in this really fertile, rainy landscape. But then, gravity tilted the Earth's axis, the climate shifted, the rains dried up, and it forced these desperately thirsty bands of pastoralists to migrate toward literally the only reliable water source left, the Nile. By 5000 BC, they were building stone calendars, like the one at Nabta Playa, just to try and predict the life-saving rains. And as all these people clustered together along the river, society got incredibly complex, eventually culminating in a totally unified nation under King Narmer around 3000 BC. So, in what is basically the blink of an eye, historically speaking, you go from these scattered bands of nomads surviving by tracking wildlife to the world's very first true nation-state. And what do you think was the glue holding this brand new massive society together? It was bureaucracy. Yeah, in fact, those beautiful early hieroglyphs you all recognize, they didn't emerge to write love poetry, they were actually invented to calculate taxes on grain and oil. Section 2, The Pyramid Age, Building Eternity in Stone. Now, this era was really the zenith of early Egyptian society. We're talking about a highly ordered powerhouse anchored in the absolute belief of a god-king. 2.3 million. Just wrap your head around that number for a second. That is the staggering amount of limestone blocks required to build King Khufu's Great Pyramid. And here's where we get to bust another huge myth. These were not built by slaves. Archaeological evidence actually reveals a highly organized, well-fed workforce of about 20,000 people. They had massive bakeries, meat processing facilities, even their own medical care. It was the ultimate display of a society working in complete, perfect unison for a shared divine goal. And these pyramids weren't just silent, isolated tombs sitting out in the desert. They were an absolute flex. We literally have ancient tourist graffiti left at Djoser's Step Pyramid from around 1300 BC that reads, "As if heaven were in it." So even thousands of years ago, people were flocking to these monuments just to marvel at them. They were essentially the world's first ancient tourist attractions, showing off Egypt's completely unparalleled infrastructure. It paints this picture of invincible perfection, doesn't it? But what happens when the Nile just stops flowing and the pharaoh loses his power? Because the entire Egyptian worldview relied on predictable nature, managed by a divine king. If one of those pillars fell, the whole system came crashing down. Section 3. Descent into Darkness, the Collapse of Order. Right towards the end of the 3rd millennium BC, the climate changed again, and the Nile floods completely failed. You combine that with a frail, aging king, Pepi II, who, by the way, ruled into his 90s, and the result was sheer anarchy. We plunged directly from this idealized Egypt of rich bounty and eternal order straight into a gritty, deeply horrific reality. The central government completely collapsed. Local warlords like an absolute egomaniac named Unktifi took over their specific regions. And we have these horrifying accounts from this time detailing starvation, famine, and even alleged cannibalism, where desperate men were eating their own children. All this anarchy naturally led to a brutal civil war between northern and southern warlords, and it culminated in something so terrifying to the Egyptian psyche that it was literally just called the Vile Deed. Northern troops actually went in and set fire to and desecrated the ancient royal tombs at Abydos. Now, for a culture utterly obsessed with the afterlife, destroying the royal mummies severed Egypt's physical link to its ancestors. It was this unthinkable blasphemy. But it actually ended up sparking a furious retaliation from southern leaders like Mentuhotep, who violently fought to reunite the whole country. Section 4. The Golden Empire. The Phoenix Rises. So, out of the ashes of that civil war and a subsequent foreign occupation, the Egyptians bounced back hard. They adopted new military technology, pushed out their occupiers, and transformed into an unapologetic superpower. But here's the catch. All the unimaginable wealth from this new empire poured straight into the temples. The priests at the massive complex at Karnak were performing these highly exclusive, secretive daily rituals for the statue of the god Amun. Things like washing it, dressing it, feeding it. By totally controlling access to the god, these priests quietly secured absolute control over the empire's vast wealth, creating a super dangerous rivalry between the church and the state. Now, the pharaohs definitely tried to push back against this. Akhenaten even tried to ban the old gods entirely. But the priests, they always won. In fact, get this. Think about King Tutankhamun and his fabled golden treasure. Recent research actually suggests a shocking 80% of his burial goods, maybe even his famous golden death mask, were actually recycled from his heretical parents, Akhenaten and Nefertiti. It was basically a massive spiritual decluttering by the reinstated priests to bury that tainted past forever. But they didn't stop there. By the end of the New Kingdom, the royal bank accounts were completely tapped out, and the priests had essentially taken over the south of Egypt. They ordered what they cryptically called restoration work. In reality, this was the systematic, state-sanctioned looting of the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. The priests literally dismantled the ancient royal mummies just to melt down the gold to fund their own political ambitions. They actively destroyed the very foundation of the Egyptian afterlife. Which brings us to a huge cliffhanger. With the royal afterlife deliberately dismantled by their very own priests and the entire country hopelessly fractured, is this it? Is this the final end of ancient Egypt? I mean, how could a morally bankrupt, totally divided state possibly survive the wave of foreign imperialists gathering at its borders? Section 5. Conquering the Conquerors, the ultimate cultural sponge. Okay, so Egypt was about to be taken by the sword over and over again. But in a brilliant twist of history, Egypt actually took its conquerors by the soul. A literal parade of empires tried to dominate them. The Libyans infiltrated the military and ended up taking the throne. The Kushites invaded, yet they became so devoted to the culture they actually built more pyramids in their homelands than the Egyptians ever did. The ruthless Assyrians and Persians brought brutal violence, but even they couldn't crush the Egyptian identity. And finally, the Greeks arrived. Every single one of these empires eventually realized the exact same thing. To control Egypt, you had to become Egyptian. Even the ultimate military superman of the ancient world couldn't resist its pull. When Alexander the Great marched into Egypt, he didn't tear it all down. Instead, he traveled deep into the desert to the Oracle of Amun, where it was proclaimed, "You are my son." Alexander totally submitted to the Egyptian gods and gladly took the title of pharaoh just to legitimize his rule. He fully understood that Egypt's ideology was way more powerful than any army he could throw at it. And this really brings us to the climax of our story, the final Greek dynasty, the Ptolemies, which, by the way, ends with the famous Cleopatra. They ruled for 300 years. And what did they do? They built massive traditional Egyptian temples and dressed up as traditional gods. They proved one incredibly profound truth. While you may try and dominate our land, our culture will ultimately dominate you. Which leaves us with this final, genuinely provocative thought to take away. Was Egypt's greatest weapon its military might, or its completely indestructible culture? Think about it. We started with a group of desperate nomads just chasing rain, and we end with an ideology so extraordinarily potent that it consumed Alexander the Great. Egypt's true immortality wasn't in its massive stone pyramids. It was in a culture that successfully conquered the world long after its pharaohs had turned to dust. Thanks for joining me on this explainer today. I really hope it completely reframed how you see this incredible piece of our shared human history.